In this video we're going to create a new shader within Unity, and we're going to use it to connect up some different textures and that sort of thing to create a new material on our shader sphere. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go into my Assets menu and select Create, Shadergraph, URP, Lit Shadergraph. There are a number of different options in here, and generally within the shadergraph you can change between any of these at any time, although sometimes some of your nodes might not transfer over. You've also got some other options in here like a subgraph, and subgraphs are really great for if you've got a bit of HLSL that you've done outside of Unity and you want to bring that in. So for this example, we're going to be using a URP lit shader graph. If you're working in HDRP, then this will be HDRP lit shader graph. Okay, so I'm going to call this basic PBR, so basic physically based renderer. Okay, if I double click this, it's going to open up the Unity shader graph tab. And you'll see that in our graph area we've already got some outputs already created. We've got a vertex output and the fragment output. So the vertex output essentially controls the form, or the three-dimensional form, shape, and all the associated properties of the 3D form, such as the normals and the tangents. And we've got the fragment, which is every pixel on the screen that this object needs to be rendered for. Alright, so that'll be things like color and all this type of stuff. The shader graph tab in Unity will work pretty much like any two-dimensional tab in any 3D authoring environment. So if you middle click and drag, you're going to be able to pan. Okay, if you zoom all the way out and press A, then it will sort of zoom back in and frame everything within your scene. You can focus in on specific areas by clicking on them and pressing F. If you click on the blackboard button up here, this will display essentially the inputs for our material, of which there are none at the moment. And we've also got options for a graph inspector. This will show you your graph settings as well as individual node properties over here. And we have a preview as well. So this will try and give you a preview of your shader. Now if you're building a parametric shader, which I would encourage that you all do, then this preview has limited functionality, unfortunately, but there are ways around that. So we can build shaders in a non-parametric way and then make them parametric later on. If you're working on a small screen, you may need to switch these on and off from time to time just to give yourself a bit more screen space. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to save this shader, because it's got some outputs on here, and we're going to see what it looks like, and then we can take control over these and replace these inputs over here, so this grey colour here, this metallic setting, this smoothness setting, etc., with image data or sliders. Okay, so I'm going to save this, which is very important when you're working with shaders. So you need to save it before you go back into the scene, and we're going to create a new material using our basic PBR shader. So right click. So this is the same, right clicking down here is the same as clicking on the assets menu up here. So right click, create material. I'm going to call this, I'm just going to call it test PBR. And I'm going to drag that onto my shader sphere. Okay, just like that. So at the moment we're just using a default material. The default specifically universal render pipeline material. So if you select your material here and go up in the inspector, you can see what shader it's using. So we want to change this. So in the shader setting for your material, just click on the drop down menu and then go to shader graphs and then find your shader. So we've got basic PBR here. Let's change it to basic PBR. And you see it's now become grey. So if I go back into my PBR shader, then you'll see that I can change these settings, right? So I can, let's make it red, for example. So I've changed the base color input to red, and let's save that and go back into the scene, and it compiles the shader, which is, when it goes blue, it's doing a bit of work there, it's compiling it, and our shader, our material that's using our shader is now red. Now obviously we don't really want to work like this, because I might want to use this particular shader on a variety of different objects. So I want to be able to control those parameters in the inspector. Alright, so currently there is nothing here. So what I need to be able to do is expose them. So expose the color setting, expose the smoothness values and all that kind of thing, and edit them within the scene itself, so I don't have to keep shifting over into my shader. Okay, so that's the next step that we're going to follow. So back into the shader graph, let's open up our blackboard. And our blackboard essentially allows us to bring in external components into our material. So in this case, I'm going to hit the plus icon, and you'll see you've got all these different data types here. Now the one that we're interested in for now is the color. So let's bring in a color. And I'll go with the universally accepted spelling of color in CG, which is the American spelling, so C-O-L-O-R, but I am going to call this base color. Alright, and you could, I'm using camel case here, so base color, each of those words has got a capital, is capitalized, but you could also do an underscore if you wanted to. So base color. Now this is now an input. Okay, so let's just save this and go back into my scene, and you'll see I now have this, with my material selected, I now have a base color input, and I can select a color here, but it's not changing anything. So I have a parameter that I can edit, but it's not having any impact on the resultant material. So let's go back into our shader graph, and this input, I'm just going to drag it out here, and that creates a node for that base color, and I can just drag that and connect it up to my output for base color. Let's save it, go back into the scene, and you'll see that now this is connected up and I can change the color. Now this type of workflow, this node-based workflow, is something that I think you are all familiar with from the previous module. I saw some of you had built some shaders actually for character and environment art, so hopefully this is not a new way of working for you. And in fact, most of you have worked, it seems like most of you have worked in the material editor in Unreal already, so a lot of this will be very familiar to you. So what we're going to do though is we are going to build up a slightly more complicated graph, and we're going to use all the different data types to populate the outputs of our fragment shader. Okay, so first up what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a texture 2D input. Okay, so this will be my base color texture, like this, and I can drag this out here, and this is going to allow me to attach an image. Okay, so this is a slot that can contain an image. Now what you'll see is the fragment where it says base color, you'll see there's a number in brackets, and this indicates the data type that it is expecting to be plugged into here. Now, this data type is a 3. The 3 means it's asking for a vector 3. Okay, a vector 3. So that is a 3-digit, if you like, or a vector with 3 properties. All right, so it could be XYZ, for example, is a vector 3 format. RGB specifically is what this is expecting. And our base color, this is the color selector that we created, is an RGB data type, right? But you'll see here this one's got 4 and this one's got 3. This is because this one includes alpha, so RGBA, and it allows me to connect it up. And it'll only use the first 3 values of RGBA, so it'll just use RGB. Now, with my base color texture, I can't do that. I can't connect it up, right? The data type for my base color texture is a T2, a texture 2D. This will not work with base color. What I need to do first of all is sample it. So if I just drag this node connector out of my base color texture and let go, what it will give me is it will give me a menu that is contextualized to whatever this is, right? So if I just use the standard menu by pressing spacebar, it will give me every single node that is possible to create within the shader graph. But if I click this and drag, it will give me a contextual menu for that. And what I need to do is sample the texture. So I'm going to select the sample texture 2D. You see it's connected it up for me. And this will sample the image that I plug into here, and it will output a vector 4, an RGBA vector, which I can plug into my base color. All right. So that's going to allow me to connect up an image. So let's save this and go back into the scene. And I have got some textures that I'm going to connect up into this material. All right, so specifically, I've got some textures within here for stone, and these are the same textures that you can download, okay, off of the Moodle page. And you see I've got a base color input over here, okay, that I can drag one of these textures into. So a couple of different ways for doing that. One way is you can sort of navigate to the texture folder over here and then click and drag it up. Another way is you can just click select up here and you can type in stone, and you'll be able to see your different materials over here. All right, so we've got stone BC, which stands for base color. So I'm just going to select that, and you'll see that the stone has gone into that slot, and we can see the stone on the object. So that works, but what if I want to modify the color in some way? So what we can do is we can create color tints as well. So I can use my color input and I can create a node, let's say a multiply node. Okay, and I'm going to drag these. I've got my base color in the top input on multiply. I've got my texture 2D in the bottom input for multiply, and I can put the output into my base color. Let's save this and jump out. And this is going to allow me to tint my texture, okay, with that color if you wanted to. Okay. Right. So we've got a basic color setup. How about if I wanted to tile this material, this texture? So let's do that next. So if I'd like my texture to tile, then what I need to do, I'm just going to organize the graph a little bit here, is I need to change the way that the UVs are utilized. So I need to create a modification, or I need to modify the way that the UVs are utilized. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use a tiling and offset node. So the great thing about these node-based editors is generally they've got a search box in them, and you don't need to know the specific name of the node that you're trying to use. You just need to kind of know like roughly what it is you're trying to do. So I'm trying to impact the tiling, so I'll just type in tiling, and generally there is a node for most things that you want to do, as long as you're using the right terminology, of course, to search for it. So tiling and offset. Okay, and you'll see this node, it outputs vector 2, which is what our UV input on our sample, our texture sampler is expecting. So I'm just going to connect this up. And on here, I can select the UV. Okay, so objects often have multiple UVs, so I can select the UV if I wanted to. In most cases, you're going to be using UV 0. And there's also a tiling to and offset node. Now the tiling is a vector 2. Okay, we can actually input a vector 1, and it will use the same value across both of the settings. So what we're going to do is replace this with our own input. So let's add a float, which is a vector 1. Okay, so I'm going to add tiling there. I'm going to connect this up into tiling. All right. Now, as default, the value on this will be 0. So you can see the value is 0, right? And if I go to 1, then it's going to tile it once, and if I go to 2, it's going to tile it twice, etc., etc., right? However, when we're building shaders, we also have to bear in mind the end user, right? So who is the end user for this? Are they going to be able to go into, are they going to understand why their material isn't working? All this kind of stuff. So we have to do a little bit of packaging, which is preparing our work for the onward user. All right, so we have to package this in some kind of way. And this is where the graph inspector, specifically the node settings, are going to come in handy. So with this tiling node selected, I can come in here and I can change the way that this expose parameter operates. So I can change the default, for example. The default is currently 0. So let's change the default to 1. So that as default, it will display the texture. And let's change the mode, which is how we interact with it, to a slider. We could change it to an integer, which is fine, but I'm just going to change it to a slider. And I can set a minimum and maximum value here. So let's just set a high maximum of 10, for example. Okay, we've got a variety of other properties here. We're not going to go into these for the purposes of this. So let's save that now that we've done that and go into our scene. And now we've got a nice slider that we can interact with to change the tiling of our object. Okay, so let's now add in the other data types. So we need a normal. So we've got a normal map. So let's add in the normal map. So let's go into our texture 2D input. So this will be a normal texture or normal map. Okay, let's bring this over. And we're going to sample the normal map. And here we do need to do something a bit special with it. So because this is a normal map, this is a data map, it's not a color map, we need to change the type from default to normal. And then we can just connect this up to our normal output. So again, we'll save this and check it out. It'll look a bit weird. What we're not going to do for this shader is build in any sort of mitigating conditions. So for example, if there's not a normal texture in this slot, then it will look a little bit weird because it is using the data that is in the shader and there's no normal data, so it just looks a little bit weird. Okay, almost looks like satin. But anyway, just bear that in mind. You know, we're not creating any conditions whereby if the person hasn't connected a normal up, then it won't display it. All right. There is a way around that. We could set a multiply up, for example, and we'll be able to mitigate that quite easily. However, let's add our normal. So our stone has got a normal map in it. Okay, like this. And something to bear in mind is when you bring your normals in, is just to make sure that they are defined as normal maps. So this one, I'm not sure if this one is. So if you in Unity, you have to say what the 2D texture is, right? What type of data is it? In this case, it is a normal map. And if you go up into the inspector, you'll see texture type is set to default. So we definitely need to change that to normal and apply. Okay, so now it looks a little bit more like you would expect. Our material is a little bit shiny, so we will deal with that next. So next up, let's modify the metallic and the smoothness. In this case, what we're going to do is we are going to create a value for each of them. So we're going to create a float, so vector 1 for our metallic. Now you may all have an image for this, which is fine, in which case you're going to create the same setup as you have done for the other textures. So we've got metallic, and this is a float. We'll set the default to 0. We'll set the mode to slider, and generally, you would have a minimum and maximum of 0 or 1 for that. So let's connect that up here. See, my graph's getting a little bit messy at the moment, so we need to tidy this up in a minute. We've also got a smoothness over here, so let's add a float for the smoothness. I think Unreal operates on a roughness, so rather than smoothness. They're the same thing, they're the same range, it's just that they're flipped. So if I've got a smoothness setting, right, then 0 smoothness would be 100% roughness, and vice versa. Okay, so generally the image maps are inverted if you're outputting a texture for Unreal and you wanted it to work in Unity, or vice versa. So let's bring the smoothness in and connect that up like so. And again, the default, we would normally set this in the middle, so default would normally be 0.5 for smoothness. So let's save this and go into our scene. Okay, so here is our material with these exposed parameters. So we can mess about with the metallic, we can change the smoothness. Now you see I didn't set this to a slider, so let's go back over here and change this to a slider. Okay, save it out, jump back in, and now I've got a nice slider I can interact with. Okay, so generally stone is quite rough, so we'd have it at quite a low smoothness setting. Okay, so there is a basic PBR shader. All right, you can see how that interacts with the surface over here. Let's increase the tiling so we get a little bit more detail. And oh, there's a problem. You see my tiling, if you look here, my tiling is affecting my color, but it is not affecting my normal. So let's go into our graph again and let's change that. So we've already got a tiling node already set up, so I just need to connect the output of this node into my normal, Save this out, and we're good to go. So the normal and the color are always aligned. Okay, so let's have a quick tidy up. So you can minimize most of these, so we can click on these little triangles and make these nodes nice and tidy and small. So this just helps us to organize things a little bit better. I get a little bit of OCD when I have lines that aren't like perfectly straight, so let's just do our best to kind of get this operating as visually clearly as possible. Okay, something like this. So let's move that back here. These can be nested quite closely because they're not really doing anything particularly advanced. Let's bring this a little bit closer over here. Okay. What we can also do over here is we can create sticky notes. So let's create a sticky note here, and you can like drop this over here and make a note. So you can go normals and write some notes over here, and this can be pretty helpful, like especially when you're learning. You can do something like this multiply function over here, for example, and you might come back to it and go, what on earth am I doing? And just name it something sensible. So tint the color selector will tint the color texture. Okay, so you can kind of leave that here, and it's just something to refer to later on. Okay, right, so we can group things together as well. So we can select different areas in here, we can group them. So for example, let's just group all of this stuff. You can group it, alright, and you can give it a name. So up here we can call this color and normals. Alright, and then we can pick this up and move it around. Alright, we don't have to sort of re-tidy it every time that we move it. Okay, so we've got a basic PBR texture set up. So that's the basic structure that you would use to create any kind of parametric shader. Alright, so we've exposed all of these parameters, we can edit them, we can control the material without having to go back into the shader graph to do it. Next up, we are going to explore using triplanar mapping.